Stage of designing the booklet, she took a good look at the current curriculum offer and going back to essentially the curriculum intent, and you would have seen that in previous Amuse Bouches. So the equivalent to that really is the core principles, and these are the fundamentals that we would expect the curriculum to deliver at all year groups. So the first one is knowledge rich. We need to ensure that the students are provided with a knowledge rich curriculum, and you'll see from the distributed content later on about how that's phased across different year groups. And it's not just exclusive to content itself, but also in terms of skill as well. We want to ensure that our students are confident speakers. So literacy in all of its forms equally encompasses oracy, thinking as well about multimodal literacy as well, which is something that our students are interacting with outside of school. We need to make sure that our students understand that there are methods employed by writers that help to create and craft meaning, and how meaning can change depending upon context. It's also a curriculum that ensures that we value different voices, that we promote equity and equality and opportunity for all. And equally, we really want to ensure that students are curious about our subject, that we inspire critical thinking within it, and that students have the disciplinary literacy in order to kind of articulate those ideas as well as they can. So once the core principles have been ironed out, I suppose, the next step really was to look at the curriculum overview, and to ensure two things really: to make sure that it was an active document, that it was live, and it was something that was speaking to the schemes that we were delivering on, but equally that it was really clear in the phased content, in this case distributed content, how skills were developed over time and where we would expect, for instance, our year 7 students to be. So on this slide in particular, you've got on one side of the slide the year 7 distributed content that you'll find in the curriculum overview, and then you'll see the distributed content that's specific to the Gothic Fiction scheme. So you can see that there are elements that are selected and there are elements that are not at this stage, and that's to ensure that we have an even coverage across all their schemes during year 7. So probing deeper now into the scheme overview itself and some of the modifications to it in light of the curriculum design. So normally there would have been a little box at the top of the scheme overview that would have explained how this scheme links to year 8, year 9 and so forth. And that was almost like a tick box, so you could see which schemes it kind of connected to. Here we provide a bit more detail, and there is two reasons for that really. It gives you a rationale and understanding for why we teach, for instance in this case, Gothic fiction at this stage and how it links to later studies. There's a clear explanation of that. Equally, I think in terms of Ofsted, although that's never a motivator for why we do the things that we do, it is quite helpful to have that dialogue in the background. So it's really clear that this particular scheme links to year 8 when they look at Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which links to later study in Key Stage 4 where they look at A Christmas Carol, and then there's an explanation about how it does. Equally, just beneath that is the connection to our core values as a trust. So this text, the Gothic fiction scheme, for instance, encourages integrity in this instance and explains how that does that. And I think that's a nice way of grounding our scheme within the curriculum of English, but equally understanding how it fits within the identity of our trust and our academies. Another element to the scheme overview is it's become a lot more streamlined. So rather than say week 1, we say lessons 1 to 4, with the intent being that sometimes lessons itself will look different across, or perhaps content needs to be returned to at different points. But lessons 1 to 4 is the coverage in this particular part of the scheme, as opposed to saying week 1. You still got the conceptual question, that's the motivator for the kind of box of learning for that particular session of lessons. And then you've got the content coverage, which again gives you an overview of the skills that are going to kind of be taught within those 4 lessons, and the content as well. Then you've been given the connections back to the distributed content, so context, technical content, and the tier 2 vocabulary. Just a note on the vocabulary, so you'll notice that each of the keywords for this scheme will always have a definition, And that's to aid you really in the preparation of lessons. So when you do go to the teacher booklet and you identify some of the keywords either in the overview or in the body of the text that you're reading, you have those definitions to hand. And there are other definitions obviously across year 7 that you can look to that are not just linked to this particular scheme itself but can be used. I think one of the reasons why the scheme overview content part when we're talking through the lessons is quite streamlined is because we've also got the teacher booklet that has the nuts and bolts, and we'll come on to that later. But those are 3 definitive pieces of knowledge that students need and should be able to acquire by the end of the lesson. The notes section is probably a lot more detailed than you've seen previously, and it's not a repetition of each sort of subset of lessons. Um, they give you guidance really about why it's sequenced in that way, um, potential pitfalls or things to be aware of before teaching. There is some duplication, especially on the writing lessons, but apart from that, you'll get some quite specific advice around the intent behind those lessons and how they're linked together, and key things to draw out from that are linked to your nuts and bolts. So a really good place to kind of start first before you start preparing the lesson and looking at those nuts and bolts. So the previous detail that you would have found on former scheme overviews would have been the learning question for each of the lessons, and then some content coverage linked to that question. That's sort of transferred across the teacher booklet. So the students don't have this. It'll be in the opening couple of pages. And the way that it's sequenced in terms of your booklet is that this will be kind of categorised as I, all the way through in terms of notation. And then the lesson itself will start on the same page number as the students. So you can transfer the same. This will be the bit that in L&P time you'll be working through with your teams and kind of really discussing the kind of content that you need to kind of go through with the students and how that's going to be achieved in the lesson as well. So that document's massively important and something that sort of tracks through the learning. In terms of how it works, you've got the learning question that's linked to the conceptual question we just discussed previously. That's the focus really for the lesson. And that's the same learning question that you'll find on the PowerPoint. Just a note on the PowerPoints, those are really stripped back. And that's why I haven't included it in this Amuse Bouche, because it's essentially working through the booklet as well with the advantages of Cameo, so you can get that under the visualizer. The 3 bullet points, refer to those as being the nuts and bolts. Those are the 3 pieces of 3 nodes of knowledge students must have secured by the end of the lesson. And you'll notice that the way that the lesson's sequenced, the overview will make reference to them. That vocabulary will be kind of filtered throughout the lesson, almost like a spiral really, that you keep returning to it and then deepening it, and then return to it again and then deepen even further. We'll talk about the tasks before we look at them in any kind of particular detail. The main thing to think about in terms of the sequencing of lesson activities is that kind of transference from concrete knowledge, so students dealing with facts really and retrieval at the very beginning, and then moving on to contextualising that knowledge within the text, and then kind of going one step further to dealing with it in quite a conceptualised way. So you'll see that kind of progression or graduation of skill as the lesson continues. And I think when we talk through those activities, it might be worth just thinking about the ability of the class that you're teaching and how much emphasis that you need to place on each activity. So the overview is the first task that students will encounter, and essentially it's a condensed version of the key parts of knowledge that you want students to understand in the lesson, almost like a preview, and the relevant vocabulary that they'll encounter at different points in the lesson also. As you're reading through, like you would do with any kind of guided reading, it's just pinpointing the vocabulary that you really want to distill in the lesson, completing those teacher techniques of either I say, you say, or call response when applicable before students complete the comprehension questions on the table below. With that, it could be that you cover all of the annotations and students do the same on their versions with their planner before completing the comprehension questions. Equally, it's one of those tasks that does not need to be exhaustive. We talked previously about concrete knowledge. It could be for a lower ability, you really need to make sure that they understand the overview before they move on to further activities. So you might spend a bit more time going through those questions, providing scaffolding in the form of sentence prompts. But equally, for high ability, you might pre-select the question that you want them to answer, and that might just be one or two questions in this particular activity because they've probably got the fundamentals already secure before you move on. The next practice that students will complete will be following guided reading. So you've got the numbered lines there, so it's really easy to say to the students that are starting on line 1, they can get their rulers onto that line and it's easy for you to use the visualizer and go through. You'll notice that some of the words are in bold. That's basically kind of anticipating potential misconceptions around those words or perhaps tier 2 vocabulary that you need to define. But again, not every word needs that level. So it could be that the students can go past the word provincial, for instance, because it doesn't really support their understanding of the setting as a whole. But words like, for instance, dwelling might be something you really need to kind of consider because that's quite significant in their understanding of the setting. So I think really it's about stripping back what's central to their understanding and what you really need to get to them at the end of the lesson before doing I say, you say, a core response in every single word or feeling as though you need to define every single word. It's again something that you need to kind of pick based upon the ability of the class. Students, after they've done that piece of reading, will then use that understanding to complete a multiple choice. And that could be something that the high ability students could just perhaps focus on, maybe the true and false questions in the next slide, or could perhaps just focus on this one practice. It might not be necessary for high ability students to do both practice 2 and practice 3. So practice 3 is linked to a different part of the extract. Again, students will complete some guided reading, exactly the same advice given in the previous slide, and you'll find the line numbers tell the students exactly where they're getting their information from, and it's a really quick activity. Again, it can be an activity that's not necessarily done with their booklets. It could be done either on mini whiteboards or even using their planners that have T and F within them as well. And that can kind of develop pace within the lesson and increase interactivity with it as well. Again, like I said previously, it might be the case that your class do not need to do both practice 3 and practice 2. It could be that they just complete the guided reading and you feel quite confident they've understood it and secured it. I think what's quite unique to this scheme in comparison to others is that students are looking at a range of extracts from different texts. And what they're really developing here is an understanding of the genre. So this particular activity, the practice 4, is perhaps the point in the lesson where students are writing and recording this into their books. And it could be that the date and title goes into the book now because they've been working on the booklets previously. And what you'll find is within these particular statements, almost like drilled sentences that students need to be able to articulate, it's not so much about their understanding of setting and Wuthering Heights, but more their understanding of how the setting links to that kind of generic convention of the Gothic, that we should see things like decay and degradation, and how Wuthering Heights responds to it. So I suppose prior to this, when we're looking at the guided reading phase and we're looking at that practice 2 and practice 3, the build up to that isn't essentially their understanding of Wuthering Heights, but their understanding of that generic convention of it. And so when you're going through vocabulary or when you're kind of explaining the event and really focusing on setting, I suppose the nuts and bolts are quite helpful there because we're just really targeting what a Gothic setting looks like. So I think any advice around that before they get to this particular practice is just to kind of track back through if setting was the main feature, if that's what they're going to have to write upon using these sentences, then what preparation had happened or occurred prior to that because it needs to go beyond just simply comprehension. It's comprehension and understand the facts of what's going on in that particular extract, but equally, how does that setting respond to that Gothic convention? So you can see here we've got the setting Wuthering Heights is shown as, the description of the building's age and damage makes it seem. So again, that idea of decay, degradation, thinking about those external forces and the harshness of the weather. This makes the reader feel that Wuthering Heights is. Bronte used the setting to create a mood of. And I would almost kind of advise to look at these sentences first and then track back through your planning and think where the opportunities are during the guided reading phase, to enable students to understand setting and what that looks like within a Gothic text. So the quotations selected for the quotation explosions are quotations that really target the focus, that nut and bolt. So the focus of this lesson was setting and students understanding what a typical Gothic setting could look like using the text of Wuthering Heights. And so this quotation should enable students to be able to do so and get them to kind of develop their analysis skills as well. The PowerPoint that goes alongside the scheme, that PowerPoint will have the sentence starters for a pure paragraph. So imagine the previous activity of the phrases and sentences that they complete is almost like their point. This is the next step, really. And it could be that you provide a lot of scaffolding around this, so you perhaps already highlight the keywords that you want the students to look at before they complete their annotations. It could be an opportunity to do a cover and show. Again, like with every activity we just talked about previously, it's dependent upon the ability of the class about how that information is disseminated to them. But again, this quotation should allow them to talk about setting within their pure paragraph. So we talked right at the start of this Amuse Bouche about the importance, I suppose, in English lessons of moving from the concrete knowledge that students need to know and able to kind of access the lesson, how they contextualize that knowledge within a text, and then to move on to the abstract. And that means that, just like our GCSE papers, I suppose, that there are some activities that students will need to really focus on, some that they can bypass quite quickly, and others that they might not ever get to. And this activity is a stretch activity, and it's one that's really suited to classes where you've got some students in the class that will finish that pure paragraph off quite quickly, but you want to develop their thinking time and you want them to kind of develop and stretch that understanding of the setting in this case. And so that kind of extensive um, thought can be done within this activity. So students are given the provocation. This example is the setting of Wuthering Heights shows that nature can be just as powerful and dangerous as human emotions. And then they're given a little bit of a frame to articulate that idea. That doesn't necessarily need to go in their books. That could be a frame that they use in a hover and show if you're doing that wholesale to the whole of the class, or it could just be simply done in their books if it's just a few students that are ready to move on to that stretch challenge. But again, it's developed that evaluation skill. So now that we've read this extract from Wuthering Heights, now that you've really tackled the quotation explosion and you've written your pure paragraph, what is it that you have to say about it and how does it connect back to the genre itself? So that was reading. This is an example of a writing lesson, and it's an interesting one because it's a bit of a conundrum, really, to think about how do you get the same level of rigour around writing in a booklet format that responds to the very different ideas that you're going to have in the class, and that's completely fine. So you'll find that these activities are quite broad. The same sort of mantra really about not being almost like a slave to them. There'll be some parts of these activities that you can run through quite quickly with your students and some that you'll really need to labour. But the first activity is the presentation of the image. For this scheme, the image is always linked to what they've just read. So they've already got an understanding of what a rundown, degraded, decayed house would look like in the middle of the moors before you present this image to them. The first task is just getting their understanding and making sure that any misconceptions about where we are or what time of day it is or the kind of weather are sort of mitigated at the pass really. So students at this point are just going to not so much build a semantic field, but just pinpoint key details, ensuring that whatever they're about to write is sort of tethered and anchored to that image. So once they've got the base details pinned down, they can then begin to extend their thinking. And it comes in two parts. So you've got the practice where they're building a palette, and that's getting them to think about colour, and really appreciating the nuances of that and the different words that they can use, and really kind of extending their vocabulary. And you'll see that in the lessons on the PowerPoints, you've got a range of different words for each of the different colours. It's about students pinpointing which words are applicable for the image and really thinking about the nuance of meaning there. But equally, you'll also notice that some of the exit questions are linked to this particular activity and will follow them in the following lesson on the PowerPoint. So it's a really good opportunity for them to kind of have a rolling vocabulary bank, and use that booklet as a way to do so, because you'll see some repetition. It won't be the only time students will have to talk about the colour brown or the colour grey. So it's really good for students to kind of track back through their booklet and to kind of pinpoint words that you can use perhaps in a different image. The table here that we've got that states isolation, wind or darkness, those are key ideas or thematic ways into the image that kind of develop their thinking to the more abstract. So you've got the emotion of isolation, you've got the opportunity to really discuss pathetic fallacy with the wind, and again thinking about darkness in both a kind of literal sense and a metaphorical sense. That activity students could do independently, but to kind of get to the more abstract layer of meaning, it might be something that you'll have to model on the visualizer. So again, sort of just addressing the needs of your class, that the colour palette could be something that with high ability you've just put to one side, or you just focus on one particular colour or one particular sort of texture perhaps. It might be that you want to spend more time really drilling into sensory language so that they're able to then think about what the key details in the image could symbolise. And that might be where you put a lot more of the guided practice into, or a lot more teacher input with that particular ability. Equally, though, it could be with sort of low to mid ability, you get to the sensory details and you find that actually I just want them to be able to do this in the first sort of creative writing lessons that students do in year 7, and really secure that before you move on to talk about symbolism. So symbolism could be something that you would look at in the week 3 writing activity, as opposed to week 1 and week 2, and that's completely fine to do so. So just a couple of queries to kind of look at with this. The the planning structure is just that. And I know it on first glance it would look like that they're going to write their response there. Um, but when preparing that, that is possible, but I think you run out of space quite quickly. It was a way of organising the students' ideas. So if you think about all those activities, they've probably got about 3 pages of work there, and they probably need to find a way of organising it so when they talk about the sky and the weather, it's this colour from the palette, or it's here where they introduce the pathetic fallacy of the wind. So it can be done in note form, and it was just a way of organising the students' notes so that when they come to write up this section, they've got all the notes they need and they're not having to flick backwards and forwards all the way through in the booklet. The waggle can be something that you reveal to them after they've written their piece, or it could be something that you deconstruct before they start writing it up. It's completely up to your discretion, really. The thing that I kind of draw attention to is, I think on first look at this, the expectation would be to write a full response, and that might not be achieved in the first lesson. That might take a little while. It could be that in your planning, with maybe a low ability group, you might want to concentrate on the opening, and you might want to get that really secure. And then the following week, you might want to really concentrate on developing character. And it can be completely fine and valid for you to be able to do that across the weeks. Equally, if you've got sort of mid ability or high ability, they should be able to cope with that because they've got all the resource that they need. And the pace of the lesson meant that actually they've got enough time to be able to do that. Whereas with lower ability, you might have had to labour some of that planning aspect a bit more, so you're only going to focus on a particular section of that. Um, but again, I think there's enough in the writing lessons, especially when you look at the resources in the PowerPoints, that mean that students can have greater degrees of flexibility in how much of it they complete and the purpose of what they're completing. So if you're looking at setting, for instance, in Wuthering Heights, it might make sense for lower ability to just concentrate on setting, and that could be what they write up for that particular lesson and then return to character later on. Well, that concludes this Amuse Bouche for Year 7 Gothic Anthology. If you have any questions, queries, or just general musings, please feel free to pass them on to your link director.